everyone, wherever you are tuning in. On behalf of the organizers, the Asia-Europe People's Forum, the International Peace Bureau, the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, and the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. Warm greetings and welcome to our webinar on war in Ukraine, responses and implications for Asia and the Pacific. It has been 22 days since this war in Ukraine started. And while we're calling for peace in Ukraine, this webinar focuses on the responses and implications in Asia and the Pacific. It looks at how states, the civil society, and the peace movements of Asia in this region and the Pacific have reacted to this war so far. And we will strategize on what role peace movements can and should play for sustainable and just peace. Since we would like to reach a broad section of the peace movements in this region. If you are on Twitter or other social media, we are using the hashtag Stop the War in Ukraine. So please share this event using this hashtag and share your thoughts, your reflection, and your call to end the war in Ukraine during this webinar. Having said that, I'd like to introduce myself, of course, before I forget that. I am Corazon Fabros of the Asia-Europe People's Forum, Peace and Security Cluster, and also Vice President of the International Peace Bureau. It is a privilege to co-moderate this webinar today with a dear friend, Annette Braun. Annette?
Yes, thank you, Cora. And I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands of Indigenous peoples in Australia and around the world, and acknowledge their care and sustainment of life for many, many years before colonisation in Australia. My name is Annette Brownlee. I'm the chairperson of the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, a network of some 50 plus organisations and many individuals, unions, faith organisations and community groups who seek to build an independent and peaceful policy for our country and the world. So very happy to be here today, and thank you for the International Peace Bureau for their initiation of this webinar. So just to fill you in on how this evening's webinar will run, we will have a range of wonderful speakers first up, and then we will have some Q&A, followed by some summing up of those same panel speakers. So just to fill you in on the quality of the speakers that we have here tonight, we have Professor Anu Chenoy, and Anu is the former Dean of International Studies at Jawal University and is with the Asia-Europe People's Forum, Peace and Security Cluster. We are hoping we will have Walden Bello, chairperson of Laban Masa in the Philippines, which is a major left-wing electoral coalition of democratic socialist and progressive groups in the Philippines. We have with us here tonight Reiner Braun. Reiner is a German journalist, historian and peace activist and executive director of the International Peace Bureau. Dr. Sue Wareham is with us tonight from Australia. Sue is the president of the Medical Association for Prevention of War. She also sits on the board of ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and Australians for War Powers Reform. Joseph Gerson, it's the wee hours of the night for Joseph, so he has pre-recorded a presentation for us tonight. And we are hoping there's a possibility that we might have Wang Danang, who's from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, a writer and academic. But That's our wonderful lineup for tonight. And Cora is now going to introduce our first speaker for the evening. Over to you, Cora.
Thank you, Annette. I think that it would be a good idea to really start us off with some context and a historical background, very brief, which I think would be provided by Anu and her, perspectives and analysis of the responses coming from this region, not only among the peace movements and also the governments that have already, voiced out their position or their hesitance to take position, and also that it would also be important for Anu eventually, if not during this presentation, but later, to give us some thoughts on, what strategies that we should be taking. So Anu?
Thank you very much, Cora and friends, and those who've tuned in. I'm delighted to be here. And I must start by saying that Russia's illegal aggression on Ukraine cannot be justified, whether because of NATO expansion or saving minorities, just like the NATO wars in Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, Afghanistan earlier were illegal wars. But our role is to document these, explain these, and oppose wars. So what I'm going to do very quickly is show that there is a very dramatic transition going on in the international system, and the Russian aggression has actually accelerated this. So firstly, of course, the US goal for global hegemony, it's now called the Great Power Competition. GPC is their buzzword, has taken a new turn. It is bipartisan with elements from the Trump administration, and you can see from Biden's speech in Munich, in which he's calling for, that the allies have to come together in this stiff competition against China. Two, the phase of the war on terror is over, and the Afghanistan withdrawal was a planned strategy for this great power competition, or GPC. Third, this great power competition, GPC, we can use this term, is a shift from wars in West Asia to the Asia Pacific. So the hegemony is going to be focused over the Eurasian landmass. You must remember Russia is part of also a Asia Pacific power, where both Russia and China are first being clubbed together and then will be separated as time goes on. Fourth, of course, the main target is China, as professed by US national security doctrines. And that debate that, that Trump had vis-a-vis Biden of first, who should they, whether they just isolate China and leave Russia alone, has been resolved. And these two countries, Russia and China, are both being isolated and cornered. First Russia, and then it will be China within 6 months to a year. Fifth, with this war in Ukraine, Russia has walked into a self-inflicted suicidal quagmire. They might get a peace treaty on their terms in the next few days, but in the long term, they're going to be, really out of this globalized economy, isolated, pushed, etc. Ukraine, of course, is destroyed, and our sympathy and our support should go to them. But the greatest beneficiary is the US. And how? One, NATO is consolidated and stronger than before behind US leadership. They're back in Europe in a big way, when many of the European countries were aspiring for strategic autonomy. Now they have kind of fallen in line, so to say, behind the US security architecture. There's a remilitarization, whereas the Russian economy and political system will be hit very hard. Then, of course, the US military-industrial complex and its fracking, highly polluting oil industry are going to be major benefits. They already are. You can see with a $720 billion US dollar defense budget just for this year. And therefore, the GPC, the Great Power Competition, and NATO has shifted its focus from West Asia to the Asia Pacific, and the geostrategic tension is in the South China Sea and Taiwan. Of course, there is a phase of deglobalization, which will be accelerated, deglobalization first for the West, but alongside a neoliberal militarized economy is also sharpening simultaneously. And you can see that from the US Strategic Competition Act, which the whole attempt is to make China and others who don't fall in line as more irrelevant. So the global South, that's the countries of the Asia Pacific especially, will be under and already are under great pressure from the US. All states, the ambassadors, their representatives are speaking to them. They do not want them to be neutral. In the UN General Assembly, while there were two positions from the Asia Pacific region and from the global South, a few countries, 7 to be precise, voted along condemnation and supporting sanctions. The others, many of them condemned, but subsequently have maintained a strategic silence, and their dominant media has expressed neutrality. Why? Because for them, they see this as as a European war. They have interests with Russia. Russia is giving all of them arms. India, for example, 60% of its arms comes from Russia. Similarly, Malaysia, Indonesia, and even the Philippines, etc., all have said that Russia has legitimate interests, and they have remained neutral, and that's what they will be. But there is pressure for them. China's position is much more serious. I don't have time to really go into that, but it is similar to that of the global South. Currently, it's of interest to them to have a multipolar world, of which Russia is a pillar. They're very worried about the situation because the geostrategic pressure is on them. Besides, there are these new, as they call it, quasi-militarist alliances like the Quad and AUKUS. All of them, are supposedly targeting China. So their rivalry is increasing. The other countries of the Asia Pacific, of the global South, they have more harmonious relations with the West compared to China. So there will be a pressure. It's going to be a with us against us situation where the US is going to put pressure on the Asian Pacific countries to take sides, or they would like to isolate them. So really, that is the broad international situation. And for the peace movements, for the civil society, the task is even greater. We have to oppose this remilitarizations and the new militarizations. We have to push for the international laws of the sea. We can have these large numbers, almost 40 small states in the Asia Pacific who remain neutral, not to take sides, but at most they'll stay neutral. They don't have normative positions. It's all about national interest, but we have normative positions and we can keep voicing them, ask for common security, collaborative security, the regional alliances like ASEAN, SAARC, etc., and small bilateral friendship treaties. That is what our demand can be. And most important of all, denuclearization. We can see that there has been a blow to that. We need to put pressure to stop it. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anu. for, for giving us that very important input on the great power competition and what it means, its implications, very, quickly doing it for us. And that very important shift. And I think that at this point, it would be important to bring in somebody from the Global South, Walden Bello, who is currently, our vice presidential candidate in the Philippines for the coming election. I cannot miss saying that, Walden. Walden is will be giving us perspectives on Southeast Asia, and particularly what it means for us here. So Walden?
Yes. Thank you, Cara, and thank you to Anu's presentation, and her presentation. I will, just go very briefly through some of the key points that I believe deserve consideration at this point from the point of view of progressives in the Global South. First of all, I think it goes without saying that the Russian invasion of the Ukraine is to be condemned. It is now on its third week, or about third week. And more than ever, it is extremely important to have a stop to the invasion and a negotiated peace. And that should really be the focus of everyone at this point, especially a great pressure, both civil society and governments should be pressuring for Russia to leave and to, in fact, create a situation of peace with Ukraine. I think that in terms of what is going to be the conditions for peace, well, I think we also need to look at what led to, the war. And I, for one, do not subscribe to the view that, this is an effort to restore the great Russian Tsarist Empire or the old Soviet Union. That I think is not something that one would be led to, given the recent history of both Russia and the Ukraine. I think that in condemning Russia, one must also condemn the United States and NATO for having provoked this war. And it's not only progressives or liberal scholars that say this, realist scholars that have been looking at this situation fairly closely, like John Mearsheimer of the University of Chicago, is very strong that this was a war that was provoked. And in my own reading, the situation really can be seen as having developed from the time that the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, 1992, leading to the dissolution of the old Soviet Union. That was taken advantage of by the United States and NATO to try to push the borders of the NATO military alliance right near the borders of of Russia. And this was a time that Russia was quite weak. It was in the hands, not hands, but it was strongly pushed by the International Monetary Fund, of course, at the behest of the US, with a shock therapy as an economic treatment. There was an effort to push through a thoroughgoing capitalist revolution. And so that Russia's own protests at that point, were not heeded. And given that weakness, NATO embarked on what really was a very reckless move to try to bring NATO right into the borders, right on the borders of Russia. Over the years, several things have happened. Putin, of course, has taken over, and he's been there now for 20 years. He has consolidated his grip in Russia. And, of course, the former Soviet republics have gone their own way. But in terms of the Ukraine, I think, that, this has in fact been one of the consistent flashpoints. One flashpoint, of course, is, that there has been very, very strong pressure on the part of NATO to bring in the Ukraine into its offensive military alliance. The second thing is that there has been a big effort on the part of the United States to install a pro-Western, pro-US government in the Ukraine, which they were successful in bringing about in 2014. And this was worked out by the CIA with far-right forces within the Ukraine, indeed even fascist forces within the Ukraine. In the meantime, with or without Putin, the Russian government, would have looked with very great dismay at any kind of entry of Ukraine into NATO. And you're talking about bringing NATO's nuclear weaponry right to the borders of Russia. I think that the only other historical parallel to this is what happened in 1961, when Khrushchev tried to install Soviet medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the United States. And Kennedy at that point said this is unacceptable, and basically launched a sea-wide quarantine that came to be known as the Soviet, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that was the situation back then. So there is a great parallel to that. The interest of Russia is to have a number of, basically on its borders, to have neutral states. And I think this is really what Putin really wants to do, is to have a series of nuclear states, neutral states, not nuclear states, and not. A condition is to make sure that those on the borders of Russia do not, in fact, join NATO. I was not here in the beginning, but I saw Kara Cora raising her forefinger. I don't know what that meant. I don't hear you, sorry.
It means that it's the last 1 minute.
Oh,
Okay.
oh my God.
Sorry.
Yeah, I wasn't here.
Sorry.
Should I just end then? I was just half through what I was about to say.
No, wrap it up. And then we can go back if you can stay for
Yes,
the
because
Q&A.
I won't be here. I have to join my political campaign, in a few, right after this. So, well, let me just say then here, and if I may just take a few minutes since I won't be here for the question and answer. The several things. One is, that there have been fears that something like Ukraine could happen in the Asia Pacific, and it's specifically been mentioned that China, might pose the same threat with respect to Taiwan that Russia has posed with respect to Ukraine. This is really a false analogy, and it's fairly silly. I think that Ukraine is bound by is not bound to the United States with a treaty. Taiwan is bound. Secondly, the U.S. is just so overwhelmingly dominant in the South China Sea. In fact, in the Taiwan Straits. So indeed, the idea that the South China Sea is dominated by China is really, really quite false. The United States, in fact, considers the South China Sea an American lake, whether it is on below surface waters with submarines and surface ships, tremendous aircraft carriers, and naval aircraft. That is an area dominated by the United States, and Taiwan Straits is considered there. Thirdly, China just would not be interested in having a kind of military adventure at this point when it has been enjoying tremendous prestige with its economics diplomacy and its a kind of cooperation with the global South countries. Now, we may have problems with some of the nature of these economic projects, but let's just say that that's been that sort of economic diplomacy has won China a lot of plaudits. The last thing that I would just like to mention here is the United States. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was an extremely embarrassing one. It led to a great loss of credibility on the part of the United States, even among its Western allies. And the kind of opportunity to try to regain its tattered credibility with its positions on the Ukraine and the tremendous pressure that it is bringing on countries in the global South, as well as on the West, to try to make up and regain its lost credibility is indeed very, very great. So here is an opportunity, and I think the Democrats in the United States are taking advantage of this, and we must understand, that these foreign policy moves have domestic roots too. As we all know, the United States is in a state of virtual or informal civil war, and the Democrats under Biden have taken advantage of this process in order to try to have a stronger position with respect to the Republicans and to the Trump base. And therefore, this sort of very macho kind of foreign policy that they're advancing at this point must be seen as a step to try to get a better position with respect to the domestic conflict that is now happening in the United States. And Democrats have traditionally taken a strong stand, a pro-imperialist stand when it comes to foreign policy in response to domestic situations in their struggle with the Republican Party and the forces that the Republican Party represent. Basically that, hey, we may be liberals within the country, but we're strong for outside the country. So this kind of foreign policy of imperial strength has always been associated with the Democratic Party in the United States. And Biden is just coming back true to form to this. So finally, let me just end there by saying that, one, just to repeat, to a great extent, while it must be condemned, this invasion was provoked by NATO in the United States. Two, that my big fear is not so much China doing a Ukraine type situation in the South China Sea. In fact, my great worry is the United States will be stoking tensions in the area in order to make up for its loss of credibility. And three, we must relate what is happening with respect to US foreign policy to the dynamics of the informal civil war that is now happening in the United States, an attempt by the right wing of the Democratic Party to gain advantage vis-a-vis the Trumpists and the Republican Party. So domestic politics and foreign policy are very much connected. As they call this is a kind of wag the dog politics, where foreign policy is very much intimately related to domestic policies and crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Walden, and thank you for summarizing it at the end. Actually, I don't have to do it anyway. And thank you for spending this time with us. And good luck to your campaign. Next off, I would like to call on Reiner Braun, who will kind of give us an insight on the remilitarization of Europe, particularly NATO. And the task of the peace movement, his impressions, his expressions and actions in Europe. What would be the result of this war in particular, you know, and maybe give us a sense as to, you know, what is the connection of the Ukraine war, which is so far away from Asia, if we look at the distance, and maybe give us a sense as to what are the new forces that are there, you know, the new alignments, the possibilities for the peace movements. Reiner?
Yeah, thank you, Cora. Thank you, dear colleagues, for the invitation and for the possibility to speak to you today. Let me start with a sentence I think we have to say. We condemn the aggression of Russia against the Ukraine. And after quite 3 weeks of war, it is absolutely needed that we will get an immediate ceasefire in the country. When you see the pictures of the country is quite totally destroyed. The main capital, Kiev, is burning. Schools, hospitals, and are destroyed. But to say that, this is only half the truth. We are even in a much bigger danger. The discussion about a no-fly zone over Ukraine by some of the NATO countries, above all Poland, Czech Republic, Slovenia, the Baltic countries. The discussion about sending NATO troops to Ukraine, called peace troops, suggestion from the Minister of Defense of Poland yesterday in the NATO meeting, and the discussion about attacking the missile defense system of Russia at the Russian border to get a no-fly zone. This means to start the Third World War. We have to say it so clear. And we are only one step before this Third World War. Listening to the speech of the president of Ukraine yesterday to the two houses in the United States, it was an opening speech for the Third World War. No-fly zone means war between NATO and Russia. No-fly zones means nuclear weapons in action. That is the brutal reality we have to see when we are discussing about military reactions from NATO and NATO partners to this Russian aggression in Ukraine. The only way to come nearer to peace is ceasefire, negotiations, and common security. I will come back to this at the end. But I think we have to see very clear how dangerous is the situation in the world now. I will not speak about the geostrategic consequences of this war. My two speakers before me were doing this in a brilliant way, and I can only say thank you so much, and I can underline quite every sentence they were saying. I would like to speak about my ideas, what are the consequences of this war for the whole world and for Asia. And my first point is, Ukraine and Russia are two of the three biggest grain suppliers in the world. They are responsible for about 60% of the grain export in the world. This will not any longer happen. This means the prices are increasing. You can see this in some countries, they are increasing by 1/3 to even 40%. And this means on the other side, we will have more hunger and more poverty in many countries of the world which cannot pay the higher prices. And this includes also the UN system. The UN food system, the UN food program, is depending to 2/3 from export from Ukraine. They will get nothing. This means the World Food Program has to reduce their programs. They will reduce their program in Yemen by 1/3, and they reduced their program in Myanmar by about 20%. And these were programs which were not enough to feed the poor people in the country. I have not to tell you about the consequences. The next consequences following these is the consequences on the world economy. The raw materials will become much more expensive. The supply chains, the blood of the world economy, the life of the world economy, that the supply chains are working between Asia and Europe, between Asia and the United States, will be interrupted and are interrupted. BMW, Volkswagen will not get the materials they need for the production, so we have more unemployed people. This can lead us to even a world economic crisis. And I have not to tell you about the consequences of a world economic crisis. And above all, the main sufferers of the world economic crisis are the poor people all over the world. In the consequences of this, we have to discuss about the sanctions done above all by the European Union, the NATO countries, and above all the US and the European Union. These sanctions are leading that materials and food for the people in the different countries are not any longer available. When you are coming now to Moscow, you see empty shops. People cannot buy it because of the inflation rate. And many goods coming from abroad are not any longer available. The support for the normal people stopped. The social programs in Russia are reduced or stopped. And the consequences are 100 or 80 million more poor people in these countries. I'm not speaking about the poor people in the Ukraine. The last UN figure by Gutierrez said that 90% of the UN people living in the Ukraine are poor. 3 million up to now left the country. These are the consequences of the war. for Asia, but also for the whole world. But like in all wars, we have also winners of the war. One winner was mentioned by Anu, and I can only support this. The United States is maybe in short term, one of the big winners of the war. The biggest winner of the war is the military industrial complex, which will be fed by the new arms race in all NATO countries and in the US. The military budgets are rising. $2 trillion for military spending is nothing any longer. We are coming nearer to 2.5, even to $3 trillion in the future. We will have new military alliances and new arms races everywhere in all countries. And this is also a huge consequences of this war. Saying this, I have to mention 2 more points shortly. The education consequences. 20,000 students from Asia are trained in Russia and in the Ukraine. 18,000 in Russia, 2,000 in the Ukraine. What's happened with them? What will be their future? And last but not least, the energy consequences. The oil and gas prices, they are going up. We will have problems in the poor countries to get enough oil and gas because they cannot pay the tremendous expensive bills. So we will have also oil and gas problems in many countries of the world. And we will have an explosion of the prices because there will not be enough oil and gas, even when the development of China will be slower than in the past. That is the brutal reality and shows that in this connected world and this one world, one war in one country has consequences for all parts of the world. I was trying to speak about Asia, but I can also speak about Africa. And I have not to tell you about the traumatic consequences what this war has also for the African continents, for feeding the people, for getting enough grain, and for getting enough energy. The consequences are, from my understanding, very easy. And you all know this. I will only mention them in short terms. First of all, and there is no way around that, is ceasefire and the reduction of the troop. Then we definitely need discussions and negotiations about the future character of Ukraine. The neutrality is the obviously goal for Ukraine. We need a new constitution in Ukraine, which include more federal aspects for the different parts of the country, so we can reunify Ukraine with the Donetsk and Lugansk on a democratic basis by common elections, observed and controlled by the United Nations. These are some points. Then we definitely need something, I have no idea how we call this, like a Marshall Plan for Ukraine to rebuild the country. I have no idea which name it will get, but it should be a highly big program. Otherwise, there's no chance to rebuild and to give work to the people again that they can survive for the future. All of this needs, and this is the opposite of what Anu and Walden were telling, these needs not a politics of confrontation, neither in Africa nor in Europe. It needs a policy of common security. So the question of common security is much higher on the agenda than before. And the report IPB, ITUC, and the Olaf Palme Center is developing the so-called Olaf Palme Report #2, which will be presented on April 21st. Will get hopefully high attention, and we have to do everything to distribute it in the world to get it well known and to get it accepted by politicians, parliamentarian governments, political societal leaders, so that we really get a worldwide movement for common security as the ultimate goal as alternative to confrontation. And I think the peace movement has to work on the same line, but have to put much more in the middle point of their agenda, the question of disarmament. The world cannot survive with a military budget of 2 or 3 trillion. Let me finalize one final point. This is climate. I think we are coming to a maybe deep crisis and maybe even to the end of the international climate change movement, climate change activities. And the circumstances of confrontation or war, there will be no discussion about climate reduction. there will be no further ongoing of climate negotiations, no climate efficiency activities, no climate change discussions in the countries, no programs will be developed. Everything is going for having more of fossil fuels and fossil resources. And the climate discussion is one of the biggest victims of this war. And we have everything to do to bring the climate crisis, the climate situation again into the public attention and in the middle point of our activities. Otherwise, we have not only the big problem with nuclear weapons, we have also the problem with burning out in a long-term way by the climate crisis. So my thoughts and my impressions, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Reiner. It was pretty worrying, I have to say. Not a lot of hope there, I guess, is what you're projecting. However, there is only one way forward, and that's what you referred to, and the importance of us building a sense of common security, and why it is in no one's interest for the military-industrial complex to be the winner. Even they will be a short-term winner, in fact, if this is allowed to continue. I might just add that we've just done a calculation in Australia of the military expenses that are accruing as a result of AUKUS and the alliance with the United States, and it's up to $250 billion Australian dollars. That is submarines and all the other things that are going along with our subservient tag-along role with the United States. So Sue might talk a little bit more about that, I think. Dr. Sue Wareham, we're very happy to have you here. Sue's a very, she plays a really important role in the Australian peace movement in so many ways. And Sue's going to just give us a bit of her reflections on the Ukraine war so far and the lessons that can be learned. And when she does her summing up at the end of the talks and the Q&A, Sue will come up with some of her ideas for the way forward. Thanks very much, Sue. Need to unmute.
Can you hear me? Okay, good, thank you. Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. So thank you to all the organisers, and I also pay respects to the Ngunnawal people of the land on which I am this evening, on which I live, whose land was stolen from them. It's the thoughts we've had thus far are very sobering, and I don't want to repeat. There's so much that can be said, but I will just give a few perspectives from Australia in relation to this war, and particularly coming from a medical health perspective as the representing the Medical Association for Prevention of War, an organisation of health professionals. So I think the first point to be made is that we really need to ensure that this war and all wars are seen from a humanitarian perspective. And it's fairly obvious, but it gets overlooked in the geopolitics. So, I mean, when we look at the numbers of people killed, injured, the millions displaced, and lives totally ruined, the psychological damage, the diversion of funding from essential services, and as has been referred to, the environmental impacts of so much destructive and carbon intensive activity. So if we're really going to look at this from the perspective of the Ukrainian people, then there needs to be, for the welfare of the Ukrainian people, there absolutely needs to be a ceasefire. And there need to be negotiations to this end for as long as those negotiations take, with the same vigor, the same determination that nations put into making war. We need that same determination put into achieving and maintaining a ceasefire. Escalating the war will simply lead to far greater civilian casualties. This leads into the imperative, again, from a health perspective, the imperative of prevention. And we look and weep at the sense of tragedy of all the things that could have been done to prevent this war, and not excusing by any stretch Russia's illegal, brutal invasion of Ukraine. But there were many factors and many warnings that exactly this was going to happen. Warnings ever since 1991. Russian concerns about security have been totally ignored. Russia was more or less treated with contempt from Western nations after the breakup of the USSR. There was a sense of triumphalism. The weapons companies moved in, and peace really didn't have a chance. So huge lost opportunity, and we've got to try to make up for that somehow. This also leads into the problem of huge problem of the double standards, which all of us are seeing right now. I mean, you wouldn't know from the news reports that the US and allies, including Australia, invaded Iraq just less than 20 years ago, leading to hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million or so dead. Where are the war calls for war crimes trials in relation to that war? That war, and we remember the attacks on West Mosul, again, in which Australia was involved in 2017. Remember the attacks on the Kunduz Hospital and other healthcare facilities in Afghanistan. Fallujah 2004, and the list goes on and on. So attacks on healthcare facilities or any civilian infrastructure must be called out absolutely whenever and wherever they occur. It doesn't matter what country, they must all be treated as war crimes. Again, the hypocrisies in relation to Palestine. We hear that the International Criminal Court is going to get working very quickly, investigating alleged war crimes in Ukraine. But Palestinians have been calling on the ICC for years to investigate their allegations of war crimes committed by Israel in Gaza and elsewhere. We think of Yemen, which has been mentioned, and the total dismissal of war crimes allegations there by Western nations. So there's a lot else that one could say, and just in relation to Australia's role, and echoing what Annette has mentioned, that Australian policy is really just an echo of US policy, and that's a huge challenge for us here in Australia to get any independent thinking. We've got huge problems with our media. The situation in our mainstream media is seen as, in the current war in Ukraine, as black and white, good versus evil. It's sort of the war on terror under a different name. There's crushing of any dissent, and the very democracy that we say we're fighting for and protecting is being crushed as we speak. Over and above all of this is the nuclear weapons threat, and Putin's extraordinary, irresponsible threat to use nuclear weapons must be absolutely condemned, as must all threats to use nuclear weapons. And again, I'll mention that my own country, Australia, refuses to rule out the use of nuclear weapons in some circumstances. So the countries with their weapons and their supporters, such as Australia, have no moral high ground on this. We cannot preach about nuclear weapons. There is an absolute imperative to get rid of these weapons, which I might just come back to in a moment. And the risks posed by nuclear power plants also, and we've read about those in recent weeks. I won't say much on that, but I think we're all aware that if any of the containment of the nuclear power plants in Ukraine or elsewhere, of course, is breached, then there are huge quantities of highly radioactive waste in both the reactors and in the spent fuel ponds. And if breached, and if this radioactivity is released, then it poses risks for the whole of the Euro-Asian region. So what needs to happen now? There absolutely needs to be a ceasefire, and these negotiations must be absolutely relentless. There is no alternative to these negotiations failing. We need all Russian troops in Ukraine to withdraw, all occupying military forces to go back to Russia. And we urgently need to de-escalate the nuclear weapons risk. In the, I was going to say slightly longer term, but it's not longer term. In the immediate, short and long term, we need to apply the same rules to all nations. So all of those politicians in Australia, in the US, in the UK, in every other country, politicians who've stood up for human rights in Ukraine, we've got to call on them to stand up for human rights everywhere. Human rights are universal, and it doesn't matter if a civilian is living in Yemen or in the Congo or in Gaza or in Myanmar or anywhere, or Ukraine. The human rights are there and they've got to be defended, and that's what we must demand, excuse me, of our decision makers. I think the next thing is that if there's to be any learning from this, if we get an opportunity for learning, every nation needs to heed what its neighbours are saying, because no nation can be safe unless its neighbours feel safe also. And that's highly relevant in relation to, well, it was highly relevant in the situation between Ukraine and Russia. But it's highly relevant again for Australia, the US and the UK with the new AUKUS agreement. This is threatening for China. The fact that it's threatening for China has been poo-hooed by our leaders, but we do that at our peril. Unless our neighbours, our putative enemies feel safe, then none of us are safe. I think I'll probably finish on the nuclear weapons threat. This is the closest, most alarming situation we've seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis, which Walden Bello commented on very accurately. On that occasion, both sides stepped back. We were on the brink of global catastrophe, and we were very nearly over the brink. But leaders on both sides realized the danger and stepped back, and there were concessions made on both sides, and that needs to happen now. If nuclear weapons are used again, there will be very little humanitarian response possible for anybody who is left surviving. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is the only thing on the global stage right now that is heading us towards a nuclear weapons-free future. We've got to put a lot of effort into promoting the nuclear, the nuclear weapons ban treaty. We've got it for those of us allied to the US. We have to insist that our countries sign and ratify the treaty if they want any credibility in relation to nuclear weapons use. And we need to reject the deeply flawed notion of nuclear deterrence, which has failed to prevent wars and merely increases their risks. Just on a practical point, I will say that one of the things we've noticed in the recent 2 or 3 weeks is that governments and corporations can act very quickly when they choose to, whether it's sanctions. I could say more about sanctions. They're not a cure-all for situations like this. There are risks with them, but governments and corporations can act very quickly. Divestment is a powerful tool that we all have at our disposal. You might be familiar with the ICANN report, Don't Bank on the Bomb. And in Australia, we have a campaign, Quit Nukes, to try to get superannuation funds and banks, etc., out of the nuclear weapons business. So don't forget the excuse me, I better finish. Don't forget the divestment tool.
Yeah.
Thank you. I might finish there.
Thank you. That was, you covered a lot, and yeah, it's a lot for us to think about, and a lot to plan what we're going to do in this situation. And that's really, really so important, that we are not only acknowledging the terrible situation we're in, but just what we as a peace movement around the world can do. We've now got the pre-record from Dr. Joseph Gerson, who is from the US Common Security Initiative. He's going to cover off on US policy and US peace movement. So Tabby, if we can go ahead with that, thanks. No sound. Can we do anything about that, Tabby?
For the sound, I think you have to stop sharing your screen, and when you share screen, there should be a button you can click at the bottom that says share sound as well. I would recommend trying that.
Thanks, Sean. Tabby, are you able to take that on board?
Is he audible? I got a message from Cora saying she could not hear.
No, he's not, Tabby. You have to press the button which says share sound at the bottom of.
First, you have to stop sharing your screen, and then when you start again, when the screen comes up, you should see at the bottom that you can click the share sound.
Okay, I'm so sorry. All right, here we go.
I'll be joining you via this
Is he
recording,
audible?
but 3:30 in the morning is a bit
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
early for me. As I begin, I want to emphasize that the U.S. peace movement is largely united around demands for immediate ceasefire in Ukraine, withdrawal of all foreign troops, and for negotiations over Ukraine's and Europe's future. There is also broad recognition that initiating a no-fly zone over Ukraine would ignite World War III, and that this must not be done. Putin's reckless invasion of Ukraine has shattered what remained of the 30-year post-Cold War era. It has triggered a geopolitical earthquake. Russia will emerge from the war isolated, weaker, and increasingly dependent on China. Here in the US, there are worries that the war will forge a Chinese-Russian military alliance. In the run-up to Monday's meeting between US National Security Advisor Sullivan and Yang Jieqing, the US threatened that China will absolutely face serious consequences if it assists Moscow in evading recent sanctions. It will certainly be worse if Beijing provides Russia with the weapons that Moscow has requested. NATO's expansion to Russia's borders led to legitimate Russian security concerns, but in no way did it justify the invasion. And while Ukrainians are paying the highest prices for Russia's aggression in deaths, devastations, and dislocations, the Ukraine war is also claiming a terrible toll for the Russian people and more broadly. Even if nuclear war can be avoided, the war has global ramifications. Sanctions and blockades are driving up the price of wheat and other grains, resulting in increased food insecurity and famine across the global south. Sanctions on Russian oil and gas exports are driving up fuel costs, fueling in turn inflation that will impact people, especially the poor. And the war impedes the international cooperation that is desperately needed to contain and reverse the climate emergency. The war has revitalized NATO and will deepen the alliance's ties with the United States' Asia-Pacific allies as envisioned in NATO's 2030 strategy. The war fever that is fueling massive increases in military spending in the Asia-Pacific as well as in the West, is deeply disturbing. Japan, among others, has committed to doubling its military spending, and former Prime Minister Abe has called for the return of US nuclear weapons to the world's only A-bomb nation. The Biden administration is now revising its national security guidance. Commitments to contain Russia will be augmented, but the priority will remain containing China in the world's most economically dynamic region. The goal is to reinforce the nearly 4 generations of US Asia-Pacific hegemony, which are now jeopardized by China's rise. US imperial arrogance has been extraordinary. While Biden was predicting that the Russian invasion could come any day, Secretary Blinken flew to Australia and to Fiji to reinforce the Quad Alliance and to ensure that China doesn't outflank the 7th Fleet in the Pacific. While Blinken was in Fiji, the White House issued its comprehensive and imperial Indo-Pacific security strategy. The strategy begins with these intimidating words: the United States is an Indo-Pacific power. It commits the United States to strengthen the new Quad Alliance, to reinforce military commitments to Taiwan, to increase spending for its Pacific deterrence and maritime security initiatives, and to augment the military interoperability with its Indo-Pacific allies. The strategy also stresses Washington's pledge to deliver nuclear-powered submarines to Australia in violation of the NPT, and it also pledges to build the strategic partnership with Hindu nationalist India. Biden is building on the Obama pivot to Asia and the Pacific, designed to reinforce US hegemony. This includes, still now, the deployment of 60% of US naval and air power to the Asia Pacific. It also includes increasing US reliance on its regional allies and partners, and for planning for possible air and sea battle against China. A particularly dangerous dimension of recent US and Japanese policies has been their assault on the One China policy. Both have committed to defend Taiwan militarily and to bring Taipei more completely into the US sphere. Separated from China for 125 years by Japan and the United States, Taiwan is developing an independent national and non-Chinese identity, which makes the situation extremely complex. The Pentagon and US Congress are dangerously encouraging Taiwan to move toward independence, challenging China's red line. Meanwhile, provocative US and Chinese military exercises in Taiwan's waters and airspace could lead to accidents, to incidents, or miscalculations, triggering a disastrous war. Much the same, as you know, applies to the South China West Philippine Sea, where US, Japanese, and NATO warships contest those of China and Russia. If we are to avoid the worst consequences of Cold War 2.0, we would do well to honor the proverbial truth that a people without a vision will perish. We are in desperate need of an alternate narrative, a new vision of common purpose to bring humanity back from the brink and to provide the paradigm needed to build enduring national, human, and climate security. That paradigm was crystallized at the height of the Cold War in 1982, when the specter of nuclear winter, and is now, threatened human survival. Then the Palmer Commission Common Security report reminded the world that security cannot be achieved at the expense of one's rival. It can only be achieved with that rival. Their common security paradigm served as the foundation for the difficult and demanding negotiations that led to the INF Treaty in 1987. That treaty signaled the end of the Cold War 2 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall. In April, a new Common Security Commission comprised of the Palmer Foundation, the International Peace Bureau, and the International Trade Union Confederation will issue a new common security report for the 21st century. My hope is that it will include some of the following: calls for completion of the South China West Philippine Sea Code of Conduct between ASEAN and China, The United States doesn't need to be involved. Creation of an Asian common security system, inclusive of the Indian Ocean and South China West Philippine Sea, and it being declared a zone of peace with an end to provocative military exercises and activities in the region. It should call for restoration of the U.S.-China strategic and economic issues dialogue. It should call for U.S. reiteration of its commitment to the One China policy and to the PRC, emphasizing that it pursues Taiwan's reunification only by peaceful means. It should include refraining from the creation of new military alliances that threaten Asian states. And it should include US, China, and other Indo-Pacific nations collaborating to address the existential threats of climate crisis, nuclear weapons, and pandemics. Is this an ambitious agenda? Certainly it is. Is it likely to be achieved in the next 5 years? That's hard to imagine. But it provides a path out of the dangers of the new Cold War that have been precipitated by the Ukraine war and by the struggle for domination of the Indo-Pacific region. Again, I'm sorry not to be with you directly, not to be in a position to be exchanging thoughts more directly, but just to appreciate that this webinar is taking place and to reiterate that I look forward to working with all of you in the coming months and years. Take care and peace.
Thank you. It would be really good to get a list of all those positive recommendations that Joseph provided to us just now. And we're well over time, as these webinars do tend to be. We won't be able to ask all the questions, but we will have 5 or 10 minutes to go through some of those. And then we will have summing up by each of the speakers, very, very brief summing up. And Cora is going to introduce a couple of young people from the IPB to pick out the highlights of what's been presented here tonight. So Reiner, one of the questions is to you on the German fighter jet order. How is this being received in the broader population in Germany?
You know, first of all, let me say to these questions, thank you. It is really very important to know that Germany is becoming now, next to the United States, the biggest hero of the new armament race, because we not only want to jump from 1.3% of GDP to 2.1% in 1 year. This is tremendously jump from 52 billion to 75 billion. In addition to that, we will have what we are calling a special fund, a military special fund from 100 billion for buying new weapons. And a part of this money will be spent for the F-35, the new aircraft we are buying to carry nuclear weapons, US nuclear weapons carried by German officers and soldiers, which from my point of view is illegal. It's against the NPT treaty Germany signed. So that is the tremendously wrong way our government is going. And the Germany is a leading role in Europe. And you can imagine that many of the other European countries will follow this bad way. So it shows that we are really in the start point for a tremendously arms race in Europe. And then on the way, discussing what Anu was mentioning, the role of Europe in the geostrategic competition. And I think this war is the end of the autonomous role of the European Union in military field. It is now nothing else than the junior partner of the United States under the control of NATO. And you know, there is an opposition in the German population, but we have a situation that the German people really don't know any longer how to go. We have this feeling with the aggression of Russia, what quite no one expected in the society. Who expected it is really lying. But you know, this changed the behavior, and we have a huge propaganda. We have a mass media campaign day and night. So peace movement is challenged. We are starting preparing our Easter marches. We are starting organized opposition. We have big demonstrations against the war. With last weekend, we had 130,000 people on the streets on 5 big demonstrations. So There is an opposition, but I'm in doubt how much we are now have the majority of the people behind us. This is a huge find for the brains of the people.
Absolutely. Thanks, Reiner. So I'm just going to give a question to Anu. There were a number of questions to you, Anu, and I'm sorry, you're just not going to have time to go through them all, but I guess the one that I've selected is relates to the sort of pressure that's being put on India's leadership in relation to its membership of the Quad, but in relation to sanctioning Russia for its actions.
Yes, there has been massive pressure on India, both on the issue of Quad and on sanctions. Now, on Quad, India, it's strategically, it's been very closely allied to Russia for years, and they're very dependent on Russian military and defense equipment. 60% of Indian defense platforms are from Russia, and they cannot be changed overnight, even though India is diversifying. And therefore, India will resist sanctions at least for the next few years on getting, and they have the power and leverage to do so. And they've done it earlier also. When India went in for the nuclear tests, the United States did sanction them, but they found a way out of getting nuclear submarines, etc. So they will find a way out on some issues, including on oil, because oil is not sanctioned. So they've just put through their parliament an agreement where they're going to take more oil and high hydrocarbons on discounted prices. Third, India is also, for the last few years, revitalized its trade with Russia in the rupee ruble. So that's to great benefit to Russia at this time. This is not new. It's been happening for the last few years. And the S-400s, which India imported, were paid for in rupees. So India is finding creative ways out, but a lot of Indian companies are very worried about the sanctions, just like Chinese companies, and they are the ones which will kind of withdraw. But the Indian government is going to be cautious, but they have to continue. On Quad, in the last Quad meeting, Blinken himself put pressure on what the outcome of the meeting was, but India insisted, and they said Quad would not be really anything more than an overall alliance which will focus on technology, environment, and maritime security without it becoming any kind of military entanglement. And I think that's where they'll continue. The Chinese and others believe that Quad is NATO of the Asia Pacific in making, but I think the Indians are going to be very cautious because they really want to continue to be neutral, even though this government is quite sympathetic to the US, but so far they have assured Russia that their relations with the US are not on account or will not damage Russia in any way. So that is the strategic kind of sidestepping that India is doing. And I would say a lot of countries of the global South. I've seen that with Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and all of them have taken a similar position. I made an entire chart of this, which I can send you. So that's how it is for these two questions. Thank you.
That's really interesting, Anu. And we had a Pacific Peace Network meeting this morning, and one of the things that was asked for was some sort of graph or visual to outline just what's happening in the Asia Pacific. So I'll be in touch with you after the meeting. Now, a last question for Sue. And Sue, the question's being put as to the situation in Australia, where Australia is creating, has made it possible for other countries, I mean, massively for the United States to use Australian territory for training exercises, and it's gone beyond that with the United States, but for other countries like Indonesia and Singapore, Japan, to access Australian territory. What will be the impact of this with the signing of the Treaty to Prohibit Nuclear Weapons, which the alternative government in Australia has pledged to do pre-election? So just your response to that, please, Sue. You need to unmute.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. The issue of and as you rightly stated, it's primarily US military that are using Australian territory, and it's sort of sold to the Australian people on the basis falsely that this will help our security, where in fact it's making us more of a target in any war, particularly with China, but any war with a large adversary. So the implications are very great. We're not going to solve them quickly. The main military base in Australia that is implicated in all of this, which most of you will be familiar with, is Pine Gap in the centre of the country, which is a huge spy base. A huge amount of so-called intelligence goes through there, but also nuclear weapons targeting, drone targeting, and other aspects of US war fighting, and including nuclear war fighting. So the position that we're taking in Australia is that we are, let me say, the position that ICAN is taking in Australia is that we're not calling for an end to the alliance. That's a position which other organisations may well take for very good reason, I might add. But for ICAN, we're insisting that that any bases on Australian soil play no part in nuclear warfighting, which is US nuclear warfighting. So I think you mentioned we do have an opposition in Australia at the moment, which could be the government within a few months, we don't know. And they have pledged to sign and ratify the Nuclear Weapons Ban Treaty, which is very, very good news. So interesting times ahead there.
Well, thank you very much, Sue. Now we were going to go around and do a last minute from each of you, the panel speakers. But in the interest of time, we've only got about 5 minutes left. And I know that Cora has got Sean available as someone looking at what we've discussed here tonight to pick up on the highlights that he has taken from each of the speakers. So Cora will close the session after Sean has said a few words. Sean.
Great, thank you. Yes, unfortunately, my other colleague, Ayong Moon from South Korea was unable to join to share this section with me. We were hoping she would join, but didn't work out. With that in mind, though, of course, thank you to all the speakers. This was an excellent webinar that covered really the cross of a number of important themes. Of course, the conflict going on in Ukraine, the role of NATO and military alliances more in general, and also what it means for the Asia-Pacific region as we see the US shifting towards the region, but also that Russia and China are both in this Asia-Pacific region as well. So that, of course, we need to keep all this in mind as we think of really what actions can we take and what role can we play in creating a more peaceful world moving forward. We have immediate actions or more immediate actions. Everything sort of needs to be done along the same time frame, but we have, of course, broad condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's a point I think we can all agree on, regardless of our position on other matters. And the call for an immediate ceasefire and negotiations being extremely central to that. In the situation in Ukraine, we have some longer term proposals for a neutral Ukraine state and the importance of such a neutrality in order to secure peace and security of all parties that are directly and indirectly involved in the conflict in Ukraine, as well as proposals for the rebuilding of Ukraine, the reestablishment of the country from this. Then we also have to look at sanctions as another thing that was brought up particularly by Reiner, and the role that sanctions play in this, including in the everyday lives of people, not just in Ukraine and Russia, but all around the world, in Africa, in Asia, and elsewhere. And we need to think, exactly what role can sanctions play and how can we best secure the livelihoods of the people who really have no direct involvement in the conflict, whether it be the people of Russia, many of whom are for peace, whether or not they can speak openly about it, and elsewhere. So we need to, of course, look at that issue as well. Humanitarian support is something that's incredibly important in these times, and also support for the refugees and those who are fleeing the conflict or fleeing Russia for lack of being able to express their opinions and views on this war. So we need to take these factors into account as well. When it comes to the question of nuclear weapons, we have the urgent demand, immediate for no first use policies. That's something I saw in the chats, but I think it was also alluded to by some of our speakers, with, of course, the greater push being towards the signing and ratification of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, something I think we can all support. We are in a conflict where Russia has threatened the use of nuclear forces. We can argue about the legitimacy of that threat, but the reality is that nuclear powers on the other end in NATO and elsewhere make the situation very volatile, and we need to constantly be working towards a nuclear-free world to avoid some of the tensions and stress that we're feeling in these particular moments. And of course, the larger call for no escalation of the current conflict, that we do not want the involvement militarily, or even some may say in other ways, of the US, of NATO, of other powers around the world. And there are forces that are pushing them to become involved through the direct means or indirect means. This also includes, of course, military spending, something we are seeing rise around the world and that we need to continue to push against and fight to ensure that we don't stay on these high military figures, as Reiner had mentioned in the case of Germany, but also around the world, in Australia as well. We're seeing these rising numbers, and that's something we need to constantly be working against. In the longer term, the policy of common security provides a really good framework in which to avoid these sorts of conflicts, not just in Europe, but also in the Asia-Pacific region. When it comes to the question of China and the Cold War of China and the US's attention that has been more and more drawn into the Asia-Pacific region, even as this conflict is ongoing, we need to understand that the US and its military alliances in the Asia-Pacific, similar to NATO, will be seen as threats to other countries, and that we need to understand common security. These military alliances creating insecurity in China and elsewhere will cause problems. I think Anu had mentioned, or Walden, also the possibility of using some of the regional bodies to work against these outside influences from the US and other powers, and to work towards really common security for all nations in Asia. I think that is about the end of my time here, so I will turn it over, but thank you.
Sean, for capturing the meat and the important points that has been taken up, provided by our panelists this afternoon. And well, by the way, Sean is currently the Deputy Executive Director of International Peace Bureau, and he is also one of the commissioners of the Olof Palme report, working on the report, and also to plug the date of the release. You know, watch out for our announcement on April 21. The report is coming out. And I'd like to thank you for that, Sean, and also to thank the AEPF communications team for providing us the platform, the Zoom platform today, particularly Tabby, who has provided us the technical support. Of course, I also would like to say that we have saved the questions and the chats, and we will try to share that with you. We're very sorry that there are many questions that has been provided, and we will try to ask our panelists to respond to them and put that also in the mailing list that of AEPF. And then finally, I would also like to say that the recording is going, the link to the recording is going to be available. Give us a few days, maybe. I don't know how that works, but you will get it definitely. And it's also live streamed, no? And then, of course, I would not be able to close this webinar by not thanking our panelists this afternoon, Dr. Zhu, Wareham, and of course, always Anu Chenoy for staying on with us. And of course, everybody, I see a big number of our friends. You know, the attendees have come from all directions, you know, from Europe, including the United States, at this very unholy hour for them, and of course down to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And we're very thankful for that. So, Annette, anything else?
No, just you know, it has been really interesting tonight, and this international networking is really important. So let's keep at it. We haven't got any choice. We want a future for our kids and grandchildren, and it's, you know, just we have got to keep working hard. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again.